Hey, my name is Chris Bale. I'm a professor of Sociology and Public Policy and the director of the Summer Institutes in Computational Social Science. And I'm here today to talk to you about how to get grants. All right, hello everybody. It's my pleasure today to talk to you about how to get grants in computational social science. Why should you listen to me? Good question. So I've been a professor at two different places for 9 years. In my career, I've been very fortunate to have been awarded dozens of grants from a variety of different sources, federal sources, philanthropies, even companies. So I have some varied experience in getting grants. I also serve on the advisory council of the National Science Foundation's Social Science Directorate, which is a role in which I am tasked with helping to define funding priorities for the entire National Science Foundation programs in social science. In that capacity, I've also worked with the Computer Science Directorate, and I've served as a reviewer and a panelist for many different funding organizations inside and outside government. So you'd think I'd know everything about this, but sadly I don't. There's some important caveats here. There are no universal laws about how to get a grant, just like there's no universal laws about how to publish a journal article or how to get a job. There's a lot of different pathways to getting a grant. There can be a lot of difference across different types of organizations, and we're going to go over those differences, sort of talk about what the differences are, and I'm going to try to tailor the advice I'll give today to different types of organizations, but I can't possibly cover all of them. And there are just a lot of different pathways to success in getting grants. Unfortunately, like so many other areas of research, it's a sort of rich get richer process. People who are exceptionally fortunate and privileged and work at elite universities like I do often get more grants than others, and there are a lot of built-in advantages to the process that I'm going to talk about. On the other hand, people need grants to do their research, and I'm going to go over sort of why you might need to know more about grants than you think you do, and how grants can help you do important major research, and sort of how you can sort of especially learn from my mistakes, because as in so many other areas of research careers, I have many more rejections than I have acceptances of my many attempts to raise money for research. So with all those caveats, I'll sort of get right into it. The first question I'm going to ask is, do you need a grant? So money's good, right? Money lets us do lots of nice things. Money lets us run the Summer Institutes in Computational Social Science. Money lets us make videos like this. And somewhat surprisingly, maybe, money doesn't fall from the sky. Even at very, very wealthy universities, like here we are at Duke University, this like beautiful campus, and endowment is something like $45 billion, right? And you might think, oh, well, Chris has got it pretty good, because he just sort of asks for money and it somehow magically materializes. No, sadly. I'm not going to lie and say there are more resources. So often, if you are hired as a professor, or if you work in industry, there's going to be, or a nonprofit, maybe there's some kind of endowment that gives you enough money to get started. That's why we often use the term startup fund for the type of resources you might get when you're hired as a professor, or you might have a research budget if you worked at a nonprofit organization. But sooner than later, you're probably going to find yourself needing money. We're going to go over why you might need money in just a minute. But I do want to point out that not everybody needs to write grants. In computational social science, a lot of our research is really expensive. We need research for paying people to participate in our research. Often we need to buy expensive data. We need to hire people. We need to work with software developers who, it turns out, aren't cheap, right? But a lot of our work does not require money. I mean, we can do research with bots that might be zero cost, or we might do descriptive research on citation networks that might be fairly little cost. We'll see, though, that a lot of things that seem free maybe aren't free. Like, turns out someone has to pay for the lights in this room here and the air conditioning that we're enjoying in the hot North Carolina weather here. And there's a lot of invisible costs that, again, might mean you need to know more about getting grants than you think you do. And that's why I've added this to our set of videos here on professionalization and computational social science. As with my other videos, I'm going to try to go over both general points about how to get a grant, but then things specific to computational social science. So I'll go over the places where computational social scientists seem to be getting grants and talk a little bit more about the sort of unique opportunities and challenges of fundraising in computational social science. So first, let's talk about some of the costs of doing research in computational social science. I alluded to a few of these, but we're going to go through them in a bit of detail because, of course, figuring out what costs you have is going to have a huge influence on your fundraising process. So people write grants for many, many different reasons, and I'm talking about grants both inside and outside academia here. Typically, we're talking about fundraising in academia or nonprofit settings because companies usually have internal research budgets, or governments usually have some type of research budgets. But even within companies and governments, you also still need to often make a case for why you need resources and why you should have resources in another, say, federal agency or another part of the company shouldn't have research resources, right? So getting good at communicating, your need for resources is sort of a key skill no matter whether you wind up in academia, industry, nonprofits, or government. And, research is expensive. So you're all probably familiar with this kind of green box up here, right? We might need to pay participants, we might need to buy data, there could be other costs related to, cloud computing if you're doing like large, analysis of large data sets, or if you're doing like app-based research or bot-based research, you may have some costs of, running an app or hosting an app and paying for the website that hosts it or things like that, right? There's a lot of costs. The biggest costs are usually, though, sort of paying people to participate in research, take a survey, some incentive to participate in a field experiment or whatever you're doing, right? And these can get expensive. I mentioned in another video where I described an experiment I ran where we paid people to follow bots. It sort of took them outside their echo chamber on social media. I mentioned that project cost about $60,000, and that project wouldn't have been possible without writing a grant like the one I'm about to describe. And that was a longitudinal study of about 1,200 people. So if you want to do bigger experiments or better experiments, you can add some zeros on pretty quickly to the cost of doing research. Now, this is probably the most visible stuff, so I don't want to go into too much more detail about the green box here. I do want to get into the blue box a little bit here, and that's hiring staff. So, many of you might be funded by grants that you don't know exist. That was certainly the case for me when I was in graduate school. Hiring people, including graduate students, paying graduate student stipends, but that's one of many things that are paid on your behalf, right? Your tuition is also paid often. Your healthcare has to get paid for. Other services that are available to you because you're at a university that you might not see. Federal taxes for Medicare and things like their Social Security that you're not even seeing, right? Someone's got to pay those. And so hiring people is really, really expensive. At Duke, I think hiring a full-time graduate student for a year of RA work, the salary you'd get is somewhere around $30,000, $35,000, give or take. That number might not be perfectly accurate. But after I pay, or a faculty pays for your health insurance, tuition, and other sort of costs, that number could get up to $60,000 much more quickly than you might realize. So staff are expensive, not just graduate students, but if you have really ambitious research, you might need software engineers, lab managers, undergraduate students, right? And again, if you're inside, even if you're not in academia, if you're in a company, right, there's only so many engineers. And maybe those engineers, let's say you're in a social media company, those engineers are maybe fixing a bug that's interrupting an important process on the platform, and you're trying to ask for their time to do some research, which might seem like a luxury in a setting where there's only so many people to go around and so many problems that are urgent, right? You really have to communicate why you need that resource and not someone else. And again, this is sort of a kind of grant writing, even if it's not called grants. Another reason people, especially professors, very often want to write grants is that most professors can earn up to 1/3 of their 9-month salary in the form of summer salary. Now, very few people earn 1/3 of their salary in summer salary, I would say, every year, but it's not uncommon for people who win grants to have, say, 1 summer 9th. So to give you a sort of thought experiment, let's say you had a nice salary of, I don't know, maybe is $120,000 for, say, at a pretty good, assistant professor position. Maybe you could make more, maybe you're certainly a lot of places where you make less, probably a few where you make more. Your total income with full summer salary could be $160,000. So you can see that's a pretty big incentive for a professor to want to care about grants, right? But again, these kind of resources can be valuable inside a nonprofit, right? Maybe your potential for advancement inside the nonprofit is intricately tied to your capacity to raise money, right? And so being able to raise money has also sort of long-term career consequences. Similar with government or company industry settings, often your compensation can be tied to your ability to generate revenue or resources. So this is sort of another important part of why people write grants. The fourth and most invisible part of research costs, and I say invisible because it was completely invisible to me until I had a fairly big shock of writing my first grant, is something called overhead. Sometimes we call these indirect costs. Sometimes we call these F&A costs. And what this is an amount of money that a university sort of skims off the top of a grant to pay for these lights, to pay for this air conditioning that's preventing us from all suffering in the North Carolina heat, to pay for things like other sorts of like lab spaces or room fees or all sorts of things like this. And you may say, okay, I use the word skim, so that probably means what, they take like 5%, 10%, off the top, right? Try 69%. Harvard University's current overhead costs are 69%. If I win a $100,000 grant as a Harvard professor, I immediately give $69,000 to Harvard that I can't spend on my research, right? I already told you that hiring a graduate student here at Duke is $60,000. Let's add a few more on if we're in New York or Cambridge or something like that. Maybe it's $90,000, right? My $100,000 just went up in flames, right? So overhead is a really hidden cost. We're going to see that overhead is more common in federal grants, that high number. A lot of foundations will give will only pay, say, 10 to 15% of overhead costs. That's still a lot of money, though. That's still $10,000 to $15,000 of my $100,000. And in rarer cases, sponsors, sometimes they're called sponsors, these are people who are giving money, will pay no overhead, but most of the time there's some kind of overhead cost associated with research. I can't really tell you the story of how that came to be. I think it largely has to do with the way that there's a sort of symbiosis between the federal government and universities in producing and incubating new technologies that get translated into businesses. And there's these sort of runaway costs, as is so often the case when contracts are negotiated routinely. And I think each organization sort of negotiates its own overhead fees with different, especially federal agencies, but also on a one-off basis with, say, foundations or other kinds of funders. These things kind of they don't get cheaper, right? They always get more and more expensive, especially with things like the cost of healthcare and the things that we're all familiar with that makes life expensive. Okay, so my goal with this slide is to convince you that you may need money that you don't know that you need, or that raising money and the ability to raise money may be more instrumental to your career than you realize. As graduate students trying to get faculty jobs, there would be very few places that would expect you to get a grant. So I'm not so much trying to pass along this knowledge to say, go spend a bunch of your time as a graduate student working on a grant because that's going to get you a job. It definitely could be viewed positively, but there's very little expectation that that would happen. What you are being hired on is your ability to produce research. Now, that comes with the caveat that your future ability to produce research, right? Once you have to pay for the lights and the air conditioning and the research participants that maybe your advisor or some other person was paying for, you have to pay for, does require that you know this land, that you understand the process of getting grants. If your experience is like mine, though, nobody in graduate school teaches you this. Nobody in my postdoc told me anything about raising money. And most importantly, when I was an assistant professor and submitted my very first grant to the National Science Foundation, I had no idea what I was doing. So I'm trying to save you all trouble further down the line, no matter where you go. And you might not tomorrow start writing grants, but I'm trying to, again, pull back the curtain so that you can see the sort of hidden processes that go into making research and learn a little bit more about what information you may need to acquire further down the road to do this. And if you are a postdoc or a junior faculty member yourself, or maybe even a full professor watching this, this is obviously still going to be relevant, maybe even more relevant. So let's turn to computational social science again. We're fortunate. Lots of people care about computational social science right now. We're getting hired a lot. We're publishing a lot. It's a hot field. And so the good news is that lots of people are giving money to computational social scientists. I'm going to start off by talking about government grants, or in the US, we often call them federal grants. And these are places like the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Justice. In Europe, it's places like the European Science Foundation, or in Britain, it's the Economic and Social Research Council. And these are governments that have decided that research is a good thing to invest in. The National Science Foundation, the European Science Foundation is sort of unique in that they're interested in funding science for science's sake. They realize that not every investment they make is going to turn into something that is immediately valuable to taxpayers, and yet they continue to invest. Now we're going to come back to that because it turns out taxpayers matter a lot, and communicating the value of your research to federal sources matters a lot. But I'm just pointing out that the need for research is there's sort of a science for science's sake need, but then there can be also very practical needs, right? The National Institutes of Health right now wants to know what makes people agree to get a coronavirus vaccine, right? The Department of Justice wants to know how to reduce, criminal behavior among those being released from jail because it'll save them money in many different ways, right? The Danish National Research Foundation wants to figure out how to buy everybody a Tesla, right? No, just kidding. I'm just making sure you're all still with me, right? But these are practical problems that governments have, and research can help them solve them. So, I mentioned that for some of these places, it's science for science's sake, but it's also for the people, right? If I get a federal grant, me personally, every single time I spend $1 on that, I say, why should the American taxpayer pay for this, right? Why is this thing that I'm doing so important that someone should have to pay their hard-won income in taxes for me to do this research, right? That's a pretty big responsibility. Governments have a lot of things they can spend money on, right? Why should they spend it on your research, right? It's a huge responsibility. More practically and strategically speaking, as social scientists, we need to communicate why what we're doing is valuable. Social scientists aren't very good at this, right? We aren't good at, we actually do a lot of research which has a lot of public relevance and importance, but we're not good at talking about why it's relevant and important. And for this reason, we usually get a smaller slice of the federal funding budget than other areas of academia. So for example, the social science director of the US National Science Foundation probably gets somewhere, I don't have the exact numbers, but it's probably well under 3% of the total budget of the National Science Foundation. So we are a tiny little slice. But we are also much more often forced to justify what we're doing. You might say, like, the biologist studying the fruit fly to do some fundamental question in biology that has no relevance for vaccines or something of public importance should be scrutinized just as much. But the problem in social science is, lots of people can have opinions about it, right? Even if they're not social scientists, right? So several years ago in the United States, the political science program of the National Science Foundation was discontinued because a senator decided that it was a waste of money and was able to convince other legislators that that was the case, right? So we were sort of constantly in a struggle to communicate our value and our importance. The good news is that computational social science has made it much more easy to do that, right? Very few people would say that, the information ecosystem is not an important thing, right? Or that predicting public health behaviors is not an important thing, or that predicting crime is to the extent we can do that, is not an important thing, right? And importantly, people want to make investments that are the most efficient, right? So governments want to do more with less money, right? And so if we can, for example, create nowcasting systems to forecast social problems, they're going to be a lot cheaper than conventional surveys or something like that. We can get people excited about our research. And so increasingly organizations like the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health will invest in these areas. On the other hand, it's still politicized. So the US NIH, until very, very recently, never funded any research on gun violence, even though gun violence in the US is a significant cause of death, especially among younger people, right? So it's political, in other words. That's sort of the thing with federal grants, is we're occupying and navigating a federal process. I don't know if any of you have ever worked in government or been around people who work in government, but a word you often hear is bureaucracy, right? Governments are labyrinthine. They have rules and legislation and rules upon rules and committees about committees and committees about committees about committees, right? There's a lot of bureaucracy, and federal grants are no exception, right? Everybody is constantly asking this question: why should taxpayers pay for this, right? So they want to be really sure that the money is being spent efficiently, that it's being spent wisely, right? And so to do that, there's a variety of very complicated processes that have been set up in most federal, not just in the US, but also in Europe, processes to ensure that this is happening. Ways of reviewing budgets, processes for communicating the broader impacts of your research. Knowing what a study group is in the context of National Institutes of Health turns out to be essential in figuring out how to get funded. Even though I had no idea what a study group is, turns out that's just a term for groups of people who work on a particular issue in health. And if you don't know which study group to send your grant proposal to, you're sort of dead in the water, because it'll just get lost in the bureaucracy. So learning to navigate the, again, often labyrinthine, federal process is really hard. You go to their website, you just see pages, it'll put you to sleep right away. It's just pages and pages of all sorts of government speak and acronyms, and it's really easy to get overwhelmed. And a lot of people stop sort of right there. They say, oh, well, this seems really involved. The funding rates are really low, so at NIH they might only fund 10 to 15% of grants. I don't have the exact numbers for NSF, but it's probably somewhere around there. And submitting to a really fancy journal, right? Stakes are high, rejection is the norm, and oh, by the way, you have to write a 15-page single-space proposal, a budget that outlines every single cost from the healthcare of the research assistant to the projected increase in cost of living salary associations for the summer 9th in 2026 for your 4-year grant, right? That might never get funded, right? And then someone has to calculate the overhead and all those other things we're looking at there. I have to have an extensive plan for managing data or protecting the privacy of people and all sorts of other stuff that you never want to think about, right? Now, it's important that we do, because a lot of the time these things are set up as safeguards to make sure research is ethical and efficient, and again, in the interest of the taxpayer. But these things are not so easy to navigate. So, if you've been watching some of my other professionalization videos, you know that I think the #1 mistake people make is to try to go it alone and to try to write their first federal grant by themselves. And just like we wouldn't expect a cabinet maker to someone who wants to become a cabinet maker to go on YouTube and start watching videos and immediately start a successful cabinet making business, right? Why should you be successful at getting grants? You need an apprenticeship. You need to learn from it. That's why I'm doing a lecture like this. But more importantly, I'm going to encourage you to try to get some exposure to the grant-making process early on, ideally during graduate school. Maybe you can work with a faculty member who's writing a federal grant. If you're an assistant professor, maybe you can write a grant with a more senior colleague who's done it a few times. Again, there's lots of people who know a lot of stuff, but no one is vocalizing it. It's a sort of a hidden curriculum that unless you are proactive and unless you work in groups and unless you watch videos like this, you might never learn. So again, be proactive. Think of it as a sort of an apprenticeship and learn to navigate this maze with other people. Okay, so that's sort of the federal landscape that we're navigating as computational social scientists. The other really exciting news, as I sort of alluded to earlier, is there's lots of other places that are interested in considering giving us money. So we are here today at Duke because of the generosity of the Russell Sage Foundation and the Social Science Research Council. We also get support from the National Science Foundation, so that's another important funder. Programs like this aren't possible without all this. But these organizations want to do this because they think computational social science is important. So the Hewitt Foundation wants to work to improve the integrity of the information ecosystem and prevent the spread of misinformation on social media. Social Science Research Council just announced a $6 million partnership with the NSF to do similar things around misinformation. The Templeton Foundation wants to encourage people to study character virtue and intellectual humility. The Russell Sage Foundation wants people to study immigration and inequality and the consequences of the COVID pandemic and use digital trace data to do those things, or archival data or natural language processing, many of the other skills that we teach here at SIX. So the good news is there's a lot of funders. The sort of bad news is we don't just get to go to them and say, hey, I've got a good idea, right? I can't just go to the Carnegie Foundation and say like, hey, we've created this program called the Summer Institutes in Computational Social Science. It's really great. You should give us some money, right? No, that does not work that way. I have to sort of navigate the landscape. I have to go look at what they care about. And what do foundations care about? Most foundations were founded by people like Andrew Carnegie, William and Flora Hewitt, John Templeton, Alfred P. Sloan. Am I starting to sound like NPR? You see what I mean? Like these are the places that sponsor a lot of our research. They are very, very wealthy people who years ago started a foundation because they wanted to do something in the world, right? So, the John Arnold Foundation cares a lot about the integrity of peer review and wants to promote open science. The Carnegie Foundation cares a lot about public impact, and they care a lot about international issues, right? The Ford Foundation cares a lot about issues related to social inequality and race and educational attainment, right? They might not care about like political polarization or social media, what I care about right now, right? So I sort of have to do my own research, and this is difficult. When we were talking about federal grants, I forgot to mention that we don't do it alone, right? Just like I was saying, we don't go through the process of writing the grants alone. There's also a lot of people inside a university who need to be working to make a grant happen. So here at Duke, I'm very fortunate to work with a number of administrators who do things like help me write a budget or make those estimates for how much things will cost. They make sure that my grant is in the format that is important, and my grant could even be rejected if I format a certain document wrong for the National Science Foundation or the NIH. Not all universities have those resources, and so this is sort of where some of the built-in inequality comes from. And just like there's resources for helping people to find federal grants, many universities and colleges have people who work in sort of foundation relations. These are parts of the university, or again, if you're in a nonprofit, many of these nonprofits fund each other. So these relationships and knowing kind of who's funding who is really important, even if you're not going into academia. And even government sometimes gets funded by some of these nonprofits, so that's less common. But the point is that there are people whose job it is to do grant writing and find grants, right? And if you're fortunate, you might be able to meet with these people who can help you do research and learn about who's giving money to what cause. One of the single most important things I want you to know about the process of getting grants is that don't just use the internet on your own to figure out who's funding what. You can learn a lot from the internet. You can learn a lot about which program NSF is running or which program Russell Sage is running right now. But the single most important person in the process of getting grants is probably the person known as a program officer. In the federal landscape, this is very often a person who might be, most of these people have PhDs, they're like you, but they took a non-academic path at some point, or maybe they were professors for a while and transitioned into becoming a program officer for a federal organization or a nonprofit organization or a foundation. And their job is to sort of execute the funding program. So if Sir John Templeton says, I would like to please increase character virtue among the British people, right, then the program officer you can think is sort of the person charged with making that happen, right? What does that mean? What does character virtue mean? What types of things should we be funding? Who are we going to recruit to help us evaluate these proposals? Because most proposals, grant proposals, are peer reviewed, like everything else in academia and research. And you know, how much money is a reasonable amount of money to give, right? And so they know most things about the grant-making process inside their organization. And you may save yourself hours and hours of work of writing a proposal that was doomed from the start because it is fundamentally incompatible with the mission or the rules of an organization, simply by exchanging an email with a program officer, or better yet, talking to them on the phone or by Zoom, right? Program officers can not only help you figure out whether your research is a good fit for their organization, but all of these program officers know each other, right? It's a network. They're all constantly talking to each other and asking about like joint funding opportunities. And so Social Science Research Council is talking to NSF, and Russell Sage is talking to Social Science Research Council, and so on and so forth. So they can also help you find out about grants in other places. So these are extremely important people who you should absolutely reach out to. If they don't get back to you, they're like everybody else, they're busy. They don't always have time to send a personalized response or to maybe spend time with you on the phone. But many of them are exceptionally generous. Hopefully by now in all these professionalization videos, you're seeing a theme, which is generosity, right? Everybody is sort of going out of their way to make the system work, and program officers are just like that. Program officers are not the people who are going to decide whether you get the grant. That's important. So you might be sort of scared about reaching out to them. You're like, what if I say something that's wrong, or that wrong in the sense that I describe my research and it's not what they want to fund or something like that, and I'm just trying to get the money, right? How do I do that? They can seem like the person who makes the decision. More often than not, they're overseeing the process of which other people, and recruit other people to make the decision. But you can ask them another extremely important question, which is, who is reviewing this thing, and what criterion are they using to review the thing? You know, imagine if you're asking a bunch of people for money, but you don't know who's going to read it. You could make all sorts of mistakes, right? If you were a statistician and started talking about Bayes' theorem as if it was as simple as like, the ground we walk on and everybody knows it, right? But if the people on the review panel are all like historians, they might not know what Bayes' theorem is, right? Conversely, if it's a broad audience of social scientists, you can't use jargon from economics or political science. You gotta use, communicate in more general. You need to know your audience, a really important thing. So program officers can help you figure out who's reviewing and why, and they're kind of indispensable in helping you out. I want to talk a little bit about the differences between federal grants and the foundation grants in terms of what you need to do to get the grant. So I've already told you, network, make the contacts, but what does the actual application look like? Usually, there's exceptions to every rule. Usually, the process is much less involved than the federal process because there aren't all these safeguards around taxpayer issues and stuff like that. So for example, you might be able to raise $150,000 with a 4 to 6 page proposal instead of a 14-page proposal with this very involved budget and all those kinds of things. That said, I just finished the longest grant I've ever written, which is 41 pages single-spaced for a foundation. So there are rules that get broken, and generally speaking, the amount of detail corresponds to the amount of money you're asking for. So if you're asking for a lot of money, you got to go into a lot of detail and explain why you need so much money and exactly what the goals are and the impact and all those things. You also need to know what they care about, right? You need to learn to communicate, just like with the National Science Foundation, you need to learn to write a broader impact statement that it sort of explains why taxpayers should be on the hook for paying for this. you need to explain how what your research is going to help the Social Science Research Council accomplish its mission, right? That's not always immediately obvious. Okay. A final source of funding in computational social science comes from companies. And these are companies like Facebook, Google, Amazon, Microsoft. Twitter's really much, much smaller than these organizations, so they're not a big funder of research, but they do fund some research. And the good news here is these places have a lot of money, right? $1 billion is even not a lot of money for many of these corporations, right? Which is sort of unthinkable. But the sort of built-in issue with corporate funding is, is there a conflict of interest? So, let's think about let's think about tobacco, right? Like years ago, if I'm a tobacco company and I give money to a researcher who conveniently finds that tobacco isn't harming people, right? That's not good, right? That's a conflict of interest. Now you might say, okay, well, tobacco is a clear-cut case, but I don't know, like Amazon, they certainly have some agendas, right? Corporate agendas. Google, Facebook certainly have agendas that often don't align with the principles of science, which is to say that these things should be independent of agenda, right, and objective and based on the evidence, right, and not on what people want the evidence to be, right? And so it is the case that often people work on contracts to execute certain research that a company may want to do, but the sort of better funding mechanism, in my view, is something called an unrestricted gift, which is where Google might give, let's say, University of Chicago, $100,000 to support the research of a lab just because they think the lab is producing research that's important to them. The nice thing about the unrestricted gift is it means that there's a firewall between the corporate interests and the researcher's interests. The researcher is allowed to use the money however they see to advance the research independent of the corporate kind of funding. Now, this is not there's still this issue of like, well, if Google gives you a lot of money, are you going to say a lot of bad things about, are you going to really feel like you have the power to say a lot of bad things about Google? Well, certainly you have the power, but if you want more money from Google, you're going to say those things, right? These are the kinds of ethical dilemmas that come up with corporate funding and reasons why it's not a panacea. Also, a lot of corporate budgets are not as big as you might think they are in the research space. And you might think, oh, it's probably pretty easy to get $1 million from, say, Meta to support something like the Summer Institutes in Computational Social Science. But it's actually quite a bit of work, I can speak from personal experience, to get $50,000 from Meta for this program. So I'm talking like, multiple proposals, multiple rounds of negotiating contracts, and all those kinds of things. So, and $50,000 pays for not much, in our program. So hardly a panacea, but another sort of nice option for funding research in computational social science. Okay, so we know about what kind of grants are out there, why you might want a grant. What happens after you get a grant? Then you just get to do the research, right? Hooray. Sadly, it's not quite how it works. Administering a grant means doing a lot of, basically in some cases, sort of becoming an accountant. You're trying to do budget projections, make sure money is spent how it was supposed to be spent, negotiating contracts, hiring people, dealing with things called line items to try to figure out which money should be spent where, what you do if you have too much money left over or too little money left over. This is actually a pretty involved process that can be a little bit difficult to navigate. If you get rejected, you're going to get rejected in the grant process. I'll tell you another anecdote from my own career. I was a first-year assistant professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and I had put together, with quite a lot of work, and without having spoken to a program officer whatsoever, which is the very first thing you should do, I was writing a grant to support some research I was doing on app-based research to help civil society groups do more effective public health messaging. And I got a rejection, and it's not like when you submit an article and you can sort of get a decision letter with like very involved reviews. You might get like a decision that just says, sorry, we couldn't fund your research. And then it might say, your grant was scored as competitive by 3 people and bad or poor by 1 person or something. You don't get a lot of feedback. Sometimes you get a lot of feedback. Sometimes it's like an article review, but sometimes you just get almost no feedback. And so I was sort of like, well, that was a bummer. I just spent a ton of time going, making budgets and doing all this, and I didn't even get it. And I was having lunch with a colleague, and he had sort of helped me, sort of start the thinking about grants. He said, "What happened to that NSF grant?" And I said, "Oh yeah, it got rejected. I got moved on. I'm not going to do the research." And he's like, "Well, let me see the decision." And he said like, you got, I don't know what I got, like 1 poor and 2 fairs, but then like 4 goods or something like that. Again, I was thinking like they fund like 10% of stuff, so that doesn't seem very good, right? I got poors and fairs. And he looked at me, he's like, "So you're resubmitting, right?" And I was like, "No, I figured this people are saying they don't like it." He's like, "No, this is like an R&R. This is like a revise and resubmit. You go back and fix the things you can with whatever guidance you can after talking to a program officer maybe to try to get some more insight into why your grant was less successful." Turned out I needed to, in this case, show more pilot results. I was kind of asking people to take too much of a leap of faith that I could do what I was proposing to do, and needed to show some more concrete evidence that I could do what I was going to do. And once I did that, I got the grant. But again, without endurance, which again is one of the most important virtues in computational social science in a successful career, I would have never gotten a grant. So I hope you learned a lot about learning how to get grants through this talk. Stay tuned for other videos in our professionalization series. Above all, I want you to know that like all things in computational social science, it takes a village. We need to do it together. We need to learn by doing with others. And I think those are the most important ingredients to getting a grant in computational social science. Thanks. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this video on how to get grants in computational social science. And I want to leave you with a few takeaways. The first is that there's a lot of people excited about funding computational social science out there. We talked in this video about federal sources, about non-federal sources, about philanthropies. The key really is to do your homework, learn where the money that you want lives, and learn how to explain how what you're doing is going to advance the goals of US taxpayers, European taxpayers, or the philanthropies that you aim to raise money from. Thanks, and I'll see you in another video.